I think failure is so important. I would say I failed in every single project. There's not a project I think I haven't failed in some way. I think there has to be a sort of level of self belief. Um, and I think if you accept that you're going to fail, I think that becomes easier, right? I think if you're able to accept that this is not, how will I put it? Well, you accept you're going to fail, but you try not to fail, right? But I think you have to have self belief. You have to have it. You have to push through. I think that kind of um, if you get to a point where you're just doubting yourself, then you're not going to produce good work. It's as simple as that. I think you have to believe in your own ability.
Hey, folks, welcome to the Fruitful Life podcast, where I hope to discuss the business of creativity and dive into the stories behind the creators. My name is Ashwin Chaco, and I'm an author, illustrator, and motivational speaker, and I will be your host for this podcast. Tell me who you are and what you do.
Okay, so my name is Gerard. I'm creative director of Brand Central. I originally set up Brand Central in Ireland in, I think, 2011. Before that, I had an agency in Denmark called Brand Central as well. Um, and I so I originally started my career as a graphic designer. I then moved to Denmark and I worked in different design agencies, and then I moved into advertising. And so I kind of spanned my career between advertising and design. And then eventually, at a certain point, I think after 9 years in Denmark, I moved back to Ireland. That's when I set up my agency, Brand Central, in Dublin.
What made you move back?
That's a good question. It was more kind of personal. I think Denmark was an amazing place, fantastic for design, fantastic for appreciation of design, and the creative industry in general is really healthy over there. So I absolutely loved it from that perspective, but I think it was just more personal reasons that family, etc., I felt it was time to move back.
Tell me a little bit about your childhood. Were you always creative? What drove you to choose path of graphic design and advertising?
Yeah, so I mean, I think I was always into kind of drawing and art and making things. That was sort of um, something that I was as a kid. I was always doing. I wasn't particularly academic. In fact, I wasn't academic at all. So that I think that was sort of became a clear route for me to go down the kind of creative route. I think it suited me quite well.
Were there any specific heroes that inspired you to think of graphic design? Or
Yeah, I mean, I think at the time there was quite a lot, but I think when I first started getting involved with that, I was kind of, I would say it depends how far back you go. I mean, I was always fascinated by any any kind of anything to do with design, typography, or creativity. So even I used to be quite fascinated by advertising, even as a kid. But at a certain point, then I started obviously becoming more aware of designers like Neville Brody and um, agencies like Whelan Associates. At the time, um, and those were kind of um, I would say designers that influenced me at that stage. Maybe just to get involved. Maybe not so much they influenced the type of work I did, but to get into graphic design and great work. But as things went on, as things developed, I would say I I became more influenced by um, design agencies that had a um, a leaning towards conceptual driven work. So, for example, um, Johnson Banks would be an agency that I would find um, now and in the past was a very heavy influence on me. in terms of the type of work that I like. I'd also say, obviously, Stefan Sigmeister will be another big influence. All those kind of, I think, designers that have a conceptual leaning or uh, maybe somewhat of an art leaning, I kind of find very influential.
Brilliant. Tell me a little bit about what you think, whether failure has a role in your career. How
Yeah,
important is it as a
yeah.
designer to be willing to fail?
I think failure is so important. I think it's just, I think you have to. I think failure it's a great subject, right? I mean, um, when you fail, I would say I fail in every single project. There's not a project I think I haven't failed in some way. Um, it's funny. I worked with a designer years ago, and we were talking about this, and he said that what he found was that when he'd send something, let's say he was sending something off to print, and he would be happy with it, and then it'd come back. And the final end result was just not up to scratch. He was never happy with it, and that's kind of how I feel. And I kind of feel it does. You always look back on a project and you kind of think, well, what could I have done better? And I think that that's an important, sort of super important part of the design process, that you're able to look back and kind of acknowledge that yeah, it's failed in certain areas. I think when you get to a stage, if you get to a stage where you feel that you haven't failed, I think you're in trouble, um, because then I think you're going to lose that enthusiasm to get it right next time. So for me, that's critical.
Um, so I think one of the big things that most creatives struggle with is their own self doubt, right?
Yeah,
When it comes to failure and then
yeah,
taking that as a personal, hit on
yeah. That's a
on
good
their
point. Yeah,
abilities. So tell me a little bit about your approach to dealing with self doubt and criticism and the fear of
yeah,
being not good enough or being an imposter, as it were.
yeah. So that's a good question. So I think there has to be a sort of level of self belief, and I think if you accept that you're going to fail, I think that becomes easier, right? I think if you're able to accept that this is not, how will I put it? Well, you accept you're going to fail, but you try not to fail, right? But I think you have to have self belief. You have to have it. You have to push through. I think that kind of, um, if you get to a point where you're just doubting yourself, then you're not going to produce good work. It's as simple as that. I think you have to believe in your own ability.
The other big thing that most creatives struggle with is their ability to deal with clients,
Yeah,
negotiating
yeah,
contracts, or even just the simple how to converse with your clients so that you're both on an equal plane as partners rather than the power dynamic that we
yeah,
normally associate with clients. So tell me about how you deal with clients. What are your
yeah,
go-to tips to
yeah. So okay, the best way of explaining this is if you take a look at the brand central logo, right? It's essentially, there's a black and a white side, and then there's a loop around it and linking two sides together. Well, that's how I see our process working with clients. It's I see it as a partnership, and I think that both sides have as much to lose. And totally, it's one of the most important things to me. And I think that you have to. I think designers have to understand that when a client is coming to them, that they're as nervous about uh, the their project as the designer should be in taking it on. And I think it's all about empathy. I think you have to have empathy for the client. You have to understand their position and understand the risk to them, because in some cases, particularly if you're talking with an SME, it could be a massive investment for them in terms of money and risk. And I think the most important thing is to establish trust with a client and to understand their position, understand what they're trying to achieve, And I think that out of that, you'll produce the best work because at the end of the day, creativity sells. So if you can help a client understand that and show that level of empathy, understand that there's as much in it for them to lose as there is for you. And I think if you can work with them on a partnership level, I think you'll do amazing work. But I think um, that has to be around empathy.
Speaking of partnerships, how important is collaboration for how you work for your practice in general?
Yeah, I think collaboration is so important, and I think it's about having a respect and a um, an understanding of when you're collaborating with somebody. The, the most important thing is to try and see that as true collaboration and not being trying to tell them what to do as such. Um, Obviously, as a designer, you need to have a vision, or as a creative director, you need to have a vision. But if you're collaborating with somebody, that's what it's about. It's not about telling them what to do. It's about letting them influence what the outcome is. And I think that if you dictate too much, you stifle their creativity, and the um, end result is always much weaker. So I think to me, and I think that goes across the board. I think it's when you're working with a printer, if you're working with a developer, if you're working with a illustrator, photographer, you have to see it as a collaboration. And I think you have to be a cheerleader for the person or the organization that you're collaborating with. You have to encourage them to do the best possible work they can and let them influence. Let them influence. I think that's just so important.
Yeah, that's very true. Um, my next question.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, in our digital driven world that we live in right now, where social media seems to be everywhere, how important is it to build a personal brand? Do you think every designer should be building their own brand, even if they're working with an agency? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a difficult one to answer. I think it's a tricky one for designers, I think, as to whether or not they should build their own personal brand. It could be a little difficult because it could kind of clash with that whole idea that if you're working with a customer or a client, that it's really about what their goal is. So I think from a design perspective, I think it could be a bit tricky. Whereas I think from a for an illustrator, I think it's very different. I think illustrators should definitely build their own brand. I think particularly nowadays with AI and so on, I think it's so important for illustrators to have their own brands, um, because I think I mean, well, Ashwin, you have your own brand. I think you got a view trailblazing there. I think and how that should be done, um, and I think that that makes people want to buy into what it is you are as a brand. Um, and I think that I would say, in particular, as an illustrator, almost live your brand. And I think that that translates into your work, but it sort of becomes more like a 360. I think that's really, really,
If you were a young designer today,
yeah.
what is some advice you would give
I still
yourself?
think of myself as young, right?
Let's say early in your career.
Yeah. What
What?
would I say?
Yeah,
Would I
what
say?
advice would you give?
Yeah. So I think the biggest mistakes that I made when I started out my career was the was trying to the use my how would I put it? going off on creative tangents, I think was something that I think was the biggest mistakes that I made, where I had great briefs from a client, and I kind of, I would say, I ignored the brief and went off on my own creative tangent. And that was, if I was to give myself advice, I would say, whatever you do, don't do that. That's a total disaster, because I think it's just too short lived. And I think that, you know, I think we have a responsibility to clients to sort of show value. And I think that, as I said before, creativity is, good creativity done the right way adds massive value to brands. I mean, I've worked on projects where we can chart back, where we can see that we've increased revenue by 20% by doing really great creative work. But it has to be in the context of working with the client's goals and the client's brief. And I think that's some of the biggest mistakes I made when I was starting out, where I did, interesting creative work maybe, but for a completely wrong brief on the wrong client.
Like with the pandemic and stuff, a lot of people, a lot of graduates weren't able to get jobs. So,
Yeah.
if you were a young graduate looking for a job, what are some things you would do to ensure that you were hireable? Or
Yeah,
what are some things?
that's a brilliant question. So I get a lot of CVs and people looking for work, and it's really interesting um, what people send through. And I think one of the things that surprises me is that they're all almost exactly the same, and it's just, and I think that's such a pity. You've just got some people have just amazing work, and they've got amazing talent, but it's always like a link to their work and a CV. I remember a particular. I think illustrators are much better at this. Actually, I remember an illustrator sending me through. He just kept sending me through these beautiful prints, and it was no. He wasn't. I don't think he was even looking for work at that. He just kept sending me these prints, and then eventually contacted me for a meeting. And I couldn't wait to meet him, because it was just he was doing something different. Um, and I think that that's the way to do it. I think just do something different. Send somebody something different. Catch their attention. I had the same thing when I was in Denmark. I remember I used to see a lot of photographers coming in with a portfolio all the time, and it was always presented the same way. It was always beautifully presented work, but I just got so fed up with it. And then a photographer friend of mine, Lars Vitrock, we became friends after this meeting. He came in and he had this backing track, and he just ran some around his work. He didn't say anything. He didn't talk through the work. He just had this music and he played this backing track. I came out of that meeting. I thought, I have to work with this guy. I have to find. We'll find a. I said it to him. I just sent him an email after. I said, look, I was blown away. We have to find a place to work, and I don't care what it is. And we did. We found projects that we worked on. We instead of just finding anything we could, um, because and he was an amazing guy to work with. So I think it's about it's about doing something different.
So would you say that's more inclined to personal branding, right? You're putting your personality into your portfolio.
Well, I think that's a different context. So I think if somebody's coming out of college, right,
Yeah.
and they're sending through a a CV or a sample of their work, I think it's great to see kind of work that's in context. In other words, a sample project for a client, like I don't know, like a theater company or whatever. That kind of thing is interesting to see. But what I love to see is personal work that gives an idea of what that person is like, and what makes them um, what makes them tick, what's their outlook, what's their spin on things. That's what I really want to see as well. I think you need to show the kind of the 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 nuts and bolts, the stuff that you can show, that you can demonstrate that you're able to come in and do something It's funny. It brings me back to when I first moved to Denmark. I I did something similar. So I went and I did my own personal project. When I knew I was going to Denmark, I put together a book. I spent probably about 6 months working on it, and it was a personal project. And I went in and I was presenting to all these really high flying, cool Danish agencies. And I go through my work and they were like, no, it's all good, that's nice. And then at the end, I would show this book, kind of reluctantly actually. And I presented and the reaction I was getting to that was like, people were like fascinated. And I think that, I came back from Denmark, I got a lot of offers and I think it was down to doing something like that, which just was show them that I could do something quite different, and what my thought process was, and how I approached projects in a kind of more personal way. So I think that's critical.
What's one of your favorite projects that you worked on, and why?
Yeah, and why?
Yeah, or like what makes it your favorite?
Yeah, that's really tough question because so many really exciting projects that I've worked on. I'm
Or even what excites you about a project?
okay. That's an interesting one. So I worked on. I think what excites me is when I work with a client who are passionate about their brand or a project. Sorry, their project I should say, and have a great brand story. So, for example, I worked last year with a company called BSR, who upcycle spent brewers grain, and that was a super exciting project because it was a environmentally friendly. They had an amazing brand story. They were amazing to work with, and we produced fantastic work. So that's the kind of thing that really excites me. It, and it can be any client from any sector. I also worked on some interesting projects for Copenhagen Cooking, where we did some really unusual work where um, instead of using plates of food to promote these food festivals, we used nudes or semi-clad nudes as a way of talking about the sensuality of food. But it was all down to the client and their appetite for doing something a bit different. But still, in doing it in the context of achieving their goal, and it was great to look back and see that was hugely successful for them. I mean, I think I saw some analytics that we managed to increase traffic to their website by 400%. Um, which was great, but it was because it was so differentiating, right? It was so different.
Yeah.
But it wasn't done in a good how would I put it, a kind of tasteless way. It was done in a kind of very tasteful way, and it was in a kind of an appropriate kind of way. But I like working with clients from any sector, any background. I just think when a client is passionate about a project, that's and when they're open to collaboration, that's the stuff that gets me really excited. It because it always ends up with a great end result.
Yeah. And the last question, the money question: what does it mean to have a fruitful life to you? What does living a fruitful life mean to you?
In the context of work, in general,
In general, for you, what do you mean? What does it feel like, or what does that mean to you?
I think it's doing exciting things. I think it's feeling good about stuff that you're doing. So I mean, I like to do. I like getting involved in doing kind of voluntary work and things like that. Things that make me feel like I'm somehow, kind of contributing a bit or giving back. I like doing that. I feel I've achieved something. In my work, I like to do things that I feel that I've helped a client. I like that. I like the feel that, like, with my kids, that I'm a good father and stuff like that. All those things. I think that those things make me feel like I'm fruitful.
Thank you all for listening through today's episode of the Fruitful Life podcast. I hope you walk away with some nuggets of wisdom from the stories shared by our creators. If you did, please do consider leaving us a review and subscribing to our podcast. Be true, be you, stay fruitful.